I never thought I'd tell this story. Honestly, for most of my life I tried to forget it even happened. But some moments leave a mark on your soul. I was 12 years old when I stumbled into a darkness so deep I thought I'd never escape. And I mean that literally, one wrong step on a cold winter night, and I found myself clinging to a crumbling ledge in an abandoned mineshaft, convinced I was about to die. It still gives me chills to remember how it felt. The sharp smell of wet earth. The burn of tears on my dusty cheeks. My heart pounding so loud in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. Below my dangling feet was nothing but black emptiness. Above, the mouth of the pit was a distant circle of faint evening sky, far out of reach. I was utterly alone, and absolutely terrified. If you had known me back then, you'd never guess I'd end up becoming the man I am today. People see me now, launching rockets, building electric cars, talking about colonizing Mars, and maybe they assume I've always been confident, always driven by some grand vision. But at 12, I was just a scared, skinny kid with bruises on his body and on his heart. At 12, I was a boy named Elon from Pretoria, South Africa, who was one slip away from disappearing forever down that hole. How did I get there? To answer that, I have to take you back to the start of that day, one of the worst days of my young life. It began like so many others in those years, with the taste of blood in my mouth and the sound of mocking laughter echoing in the schoolyard. I pressed my tongue against the cut on the inside of my lip, wincing at the sting. A few meters away, I could see the three boys who had cornered me earlier. They were now high-fiving each other, proud that they'd made me bleed. I kept my head down and pretended to be absorbed in retying my shoelaces, hoping they'd leave me alone for the rest of the walk home. Pretoria's afternoon sun was relentless as I trudged along the dusty sidewalk. Other kids streamed out of school, laughing with friends or hurrying to catch their buses. I walked alone, as usual. My backpack felt especially heavy that day, not because of textbooks, but from the weight of dread. Often those bullies followed me partway, shoving and taunting until they grew bored or a teacher's car drove by. Today, thankfully, they'd stayed at the school gates, satisfied they'd made me miserable enough. My lip throbbed. I tasted blood and fought back the tears that always threatened after these encounters. Don't cry, I muttered to myself, a mantra I'd repeated countless times. I could handle the physical pain. It was the humiliation that hurt worse, the way they laughed as I lay on the ground, the awful names they called me. Weirdo. Nerd. Freak. One of them had even spat on me. The memory made my cheeks burn with shame. By 12 years old, I already knew too well how cruel kids can be. I wasn't like them, and they sensed it. I loved to read, disappearing into encyclopedias and science fiction novels. I daydreamed about inventions, sometimes so engrossed in my own imaginary worlds that I barely spoke in class. And I was hopeless at sports, which made me an easy target on the playground. Being different was practically an invitation to torment in that environment. Still rubbing my sore lip, I dared to think about the one place I might find a bit of comfort, home. Both my parents were supposed to be home after work today, which gave me a flicker of hope. Maybe I could hide in my room and lose myself in a computer program or a comic book. Maybe Mom would notice my split lip and give me a hug. Mom's hugs always made things a bit better, even though I was at the age where I'd squirm and protest that I didn't need them. If Mom wasn't around, I'd have to hide my injuries from Dad. He didn't tolerate what he considered weakness. Toughen up, Elon, he'd say with a frown whenever he saw a bruise or scrape. He seemed to think getting bullied was somehow my fault for not fighting back. I wasn't so sure about that. Mostly, it just hurt. When I stepped off the bus near our house and walked up the brick path, I could already hear raised voices inside. My stomach clenched. The front door was slightly open, and from the entryway I heard my parents shouting in the living room. Can't keep doing this, Errol. The kids, that was Mom's voice, tight with frustration. Dad's voice cut through, angry and loud. Don't tell me how to run my life, May. I provide everything, and you just criticize. I winced. They were fighting again. Their arguments had become more frequent in the past year, ever since the divorce proceedings started. Once, I'd found Mom crying at the dining table after Dad stormed out. Another time, Dad left for a week without saying where he was going. Even at 12, I understood what divorce meant, and I dreaded it. Clutching my backpack, I tried to slip quietly toward the stairs. If I could reach my room, maybe I could wait out the storm. I had one foot on the bottom step when Dad's voice boomed from the doorway, catching me off guard. "Elon, get in here." I froze, my heart sinking. Slowly, I turned and walked into the living room. Mom stood by the sofa, arms crossed tightly, eyes red. Dad was pacing near the coffee table, his face flushed with anger. Both of them looked at me, and their expressions changed, their fight briefly on pause. Dad's eyes narrowed at my appearance. "What happened to you?" he demanded. I lifted a hand to my swollen lip. "It's nothing. Just some boys at school," I mumbled. Mom's face crumpled in concern. "Oh honey, your lip. Were you in a fight?" That word, fight, implied I'd fought back. A bitter laugh tried to rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. They were picking on me again. "But I'm okay," I said, though my voice was barely above a whisper. Dad stepped closer and tilted my chin up, inspecting the damage. His grip was firm, not gentle. He tooted, shaking his head. "This is the third time this month, isn't it? I've told you, you need to stand up for yourself, son. Fight back. How many times do I have to tell you?" I pulled away, my cheeks burning with a mix of shame and anger. "They're bigger than me. 3 of them." I tried, I lied, though in truth I hadn't tried today. I'd long since learned it only made things worse. Dad threw his hands up in a dismissive gesture. "Excuses. If you don't toughen up, they'll never stop. The world's not kind to anyone who can't hold their own, Elon. Better learn that now." Mom moved between us, putting a protective hand on my shoulder. "Errol, yelling at him won't help. Can't you see he's hurt?" "He has to learn," Dad retorted, his tone sharp. He pointed a finger at me. "The real world isn't going to coddle him like you do, May. Maybe we should consider a boarding school, somewhere they can knock some sense into him." A jolt of fear went through me. Boarding school? Being sent away from home on top of everything else? I glanced at Mom anxiously. She glared at Dad. "You will do no such thing. He needs our support, not to be shipped off." Dad snorted. "What he needs is a dose of discipline. Look at him," he gestured at me as though I weren't standing right there. "This keeps happening. He either fights or finds another way to deal with it." I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from crying. I hated this, hated that I was the reason they were fighting even more, and hated that Dad's disappointment stung worse than the bullying sometimes. He acted as if I chose to be this miserable. A tear slipped down my face despite my efforts. Mom saw it and wrapped her arm around me tighter. "Elon, sweetheart, go on upstairs," she said softly. "I'll bring you some ice." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and fled up the staircase, my vision blurring. As I reached the top, I heard their voices rise again, each blaming the other for how I turned out. I shut my bedroom door against the words. In my room, the familiar clutter of books, computer parts, and model rockets greeted me, normally a refuge. But even here, I felt trapped. I tossed my backpack aside and sank onto my bed, gingerly touching my swollen lip and the forming bruise on my cheek. The physical aches were bearable, it was everything else that hurt in a way I didn't have words for. Why does this have to be my life? I thought miserably. Bullied at school, chaos at home. It felt like there was no safe place left for me. I lay back and stared up at the ceiling, blinking away hot tears. Downstairs, I could hear muffled bursts of anger from my parents' fight. A heavy hollowness settled in my chest. After a minute, there was a soft knock on my door, and Mom slipped inside with a washcloth-wrapped bundle of ice. Her eyes were shiny with unshed tears, but she gave me a gentle smile as she sat on the edge of my bed. "Here, love," she whispered, reaching out and pressing the cold bundle to my lip. I winced, then sighed as the numbing chill eased some of the sting. Thanks, I managed to say. We sat quietly for a moment. She brushed a strand of hair off my forehead, and I closed my eyes, leaning into her touch. Was it the same boys as before? She asked softly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She sighed, a tremble in it. I'm sorry, Elon. I wish I knew how to make it stop. It's not your fault, I murmured. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, blinking rapidly. I didn't want her to see me cry. Not again. If it keeps happening, we might need to talk to the school administrators or their parents, she began, but I cut her off quickly, a surge of panic flaring. No. That will just make it worse, I said, too loudly. I took a breath and continued, softer, if they find out I told, it'll get worse. They always find out. The thought of those bullies hearing that my mom complained on my behalf made me feel instantly nauseous. They'd call me a snitch on top of everything else and probably beat me twice as hard. Mom pursed her lips in frustration but nodded. She knew I was right. That was the awful truth. There was no simple solution. We both felt powerless. After a pause, she asked gently, have you ever tried to fight back? Even just once? Sometimes if you stand up to them. Her question echoed Dad's, but her tone was gentle, concerned. I could hear the desperation in her voice. She hated seeing me like this and was grasping for any solution. I closed my eyes. I did, once, I admitted quietly. It was last year, remember? I tried to hit back when they cornered me by the lockers. I gingerly touched a faint scar above my eyebrow. That's how I got this. They threw me down a flight of stairs. I blacked out in the hallway. My voice trembled despite my efforts to keep it steady. That memory was one of the most humiliating and frightening in my life, coming to in a hospital bed, Mom holding my hand, my face swollen and body aching everywhere. It had taken weeks to recover. Mom drew a sharp breath, her eyes filling with tears as she recalled that day. She gently touched the scar on my brow, then pulled me into a hug. I let her hold me, my face against her shoulder. I could feel her crying softly, and that made my own tears finally spill over. We stayed like that for a minute, both of us releasing some of the pain. Then she pulled back and cupped my face in her hands. It's going to be okay, she said quietly, though her eyes were uncertain. It won't always be like this. You're so smart and kind, Elon. Someday this will all be behind you, I promise. You'll find your place. People who appreciate you. I wanted desperately to believe her. I nodded, wiping my cheeks with the back of my hand. Maybe, I managed to reply. She stood up and kissed my forehead. I have to go check on your brother and sister, but I'll come back later, all right? Get some rest. I'll call you when dinner's ready. I'd nearly forgotten about my younger siblings and all the chaos of my own feelings. They were playing at a neighbor's house after school, thankfully far away from Mom and Dad's arguing. I suddenly felt guilty. Mom had even more to worry about than just me. I'm okay, Mom, I said, trying to give her a tiny smile. Thanks. She gave me a last concerned look, then left the room, shutting the door behind her. Silence settled over the room again, broken only by the faint murmur of my parents' voices downstairs. My tears had dried, but a heavy despair remained. I picked up one of my model rockets from the bedside table, a tiny replica of the space shuttle I'd built from a kit. The black and white rocket felt solid in my hand, a reminder of dreams that felt very far away right now. Space, technology, a future where I wasn't powerless, it all seemed like another lifetime. I tried to imagine that better future Mom talked about. A future where I wasn't afraid, where I maybe even did something great, built real rockets, or gadgets that people admired. A spark of longing flared in me. But then a crash came from downstairs, like a plate shattering, followed by more shouting. My chest tightened. That spark of hope guttered and died. I couldn't take this anymore. Any of it. In a fog of anger and hurt, I made a snap decision. I had to get out of here. Even if just for a night, I needed to escape this house, this feeling of being cornered on all sides. Quickly, before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed my jacket off my chair. From my desk drawer, I took the small stash of cash I had, just a few crumpled rand notes and some coins I had saved. My hand brushed a floppy disk with some game code I'd been writing. For a split second, I considered taking something meaningful with me. But what? There was nothing that mattered more than getting away right now. I eased open my bedroom door. The argument was still raging toward the kitchen. They wouldn't hear me. I crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky middle one. By the front door, I saw pieces of a broken vase scattered on the floor, collateral damage from my parents' fight. I stepped around the shards, opened the door as quietly as I could, and slipped out into the dusk. Outside, I took a breath of the cool evening air. It wasn't completely dark yet. The sky was deep blue, the first stars just appearing. I felt a weird mix of fear and relief just being out of the house. I started walking, fast, down the street. I didn't know exactly where I was going, I just had an overwhelming urge to get as far away as possible. The bus stop at the corner was empty by the time I got there. I checked my watch, the usual after-school buses had long gone. Still, I waited, arms wrapped around myself. A part of me wasn't even sure what I was doing, just that I couldn't go back. After a few long minutes, headlights appeared down the road. A city bus groaned to a halt in front of me with a hiss of brakes. The doors clattered open, and the driver gave me a puzzled look. I recognized him from the route I usually took home earlier in the afternoon. "You all right, kid? This isn't your usual stop, is it?" he asked, his accent thick with Afrikaans. My throat was dry. I'm fine. Just need a ride, I managed. I climbed the steps, avoiding his gaze, and fumbled a couple of rand coins into the fare box. The driver eyed my bruised face and rumpled school uniform but, thankfully, didn't press me. "Where to?" "Into town, please," I said quietly. He shrugged and pulled the lever to shut the door. I took a seat near the middle of the empty bus. Aside from an older woman with shopping bags up front and a teenage couple whispering together in the back, I was the only passenger. None of them paid me any attention. As the bus rumbled to life and pulled away, I stared out the window. The familiar streets of my neighborhood rolled by, lit by street lamps now. We passed the small park where Mom took us on picnics when we were younger. We passed the movie theater downtown with its bright posters, rows of closed shops behind their metal shutters. Each sight was a reminder of normal life, the life I was temporarily running away from. My heart was still pounding from my flight out of the house. But with each block the bus put between me and home, I felt a little of the pressure in my chest ease. At least I was moving. At least I wasn't stuck there in that shouting house or at that school, not for this hour at least. Eventually, the bus reached the end of the line on the outskirts of the city. The driver called out the last stop, jolting me from my daze. I hadn't really planned this far. I stepped off into a quiet, industrial area I didn't recognize. The bus rumbled away behind me, leaving me alone on a deserted road. In the dim orange glow of a streetlight, I saw warehouses and factories, all shut down for the night. Further ahead, the pavement ended near a chain-link fence surrounding some kind of construction site or old mining lot. A battered sign on the fence read "Danger, keep out" in both English and Afrikaans. The night had grown cold. I shivered in my light jacket, suddenly very aware that I was just a kid far from home with no plan and nowhere to go. Doubt started creeping in. Maybe this had been a terrible idea. But the thought of slinking back home to my parents' fights and to another day of torment at school made me dismiss that idea. I wasn't ready to go back. I decided to look around a little, hoping maybe to find a phone booth to call my cousin or figure out some place to stay for the night. Walking carefully along the cracked pavement, I approached the fenced construction area. A rusted sign on the fence indeed said "Danger, keep out." The fence itself had a gaping hole where the chain link had been cut or pried apart, big enough for a skinny kid like me to slip through. I hesitated. The sensible voice in my head, sounding a lot like Mom's, told me I had no business going in there. It was probably crawling with trouble, anything from junkies to stray dogs to the earth giving way beneath my feet. The news always had stories of accidents in places like this. But another part of me, a reckless, despairing part, didn't care. Actually, at that moment, I almost welcomed the danger. Climbing through that fence felt like defiance, like I was finally making a choice in my life that was mine. No bullies, no parents, just me deciding to walk straight into the most forbidden place around. If I couldn't fight those boys, if I couldn't fix my parents' marriage, at least I could face down this one fear. Even if it was stupid, even if it was dangerous, there was a twisted sense of empowerment in it. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the loose chain link aside and stepped through the fence. Inside, the sight was dark and silent except for the distant drip of water and the sound of my own breathing. The streetlight's glow barely penetrated here. I waited a few moments for my eyes to adjust to the dark. Shapes of half-built structures and piles of materials gradually emerged in grainy silhouettes against faint moonlight. I ventured further in, picking my way around concrete blocks and steel rods. There was a hulking shape of a crane or excavator, long abandoned. A few decrepit sheds with missing doors. And looming ahead, the outline of an old mine elevator tower, the kind that would lower workers into the ground decades ago. It was clearly not functional, parts of the metal frame were missing, and the whole thing leaned precariously, like a giant skeletal creature frozen in mid-fall. A normal kid might have turned back at this point. But I was not feeling like a normal kid. Heart-thudding but fueled by a strange mix of anger and adrenaline, I approached the old mining structure. At the base of the tower, there was indeed a shaft opening, a gaping maw in the earth, partially covered by planks of wood. The construction crew must have been in the process of sealing it up when they abandoned the project. Half of it was still exposed. I inched closer to the edge, curiosity momentarily outweighing fear. I picked up a loose chunk of concrete and tossed it in, listening for it to hit the bottom. I counted silently, 1 second, 2, 3. I didn't hear it land. Either it was incredibly deep, or the sound just didn't reach me. A chill ran through me as I imagined that endless drop. I was about to stand up and back away when my foot caught on something, a stray piece of rebar protruding from the ground. I stumbled with a yelp, windmilling my arms to keep balance. My left foot landed on one of the old wooden planks. There was a sickening crack as the rotten board gave way under my weight. I plunged through. Reflexively, I threw out my hands and managed to grab hold of the jagged edge of the opening. My body slammed against the side of the shaft with a jolt, legs dangling in midair. A cry tore from my throat. For an instant, hope surged. I hadn't fallen yet. I was hanging on. But the rim of the hole was just loose dirt and crumbling concrete. My fingers were slipping. Help! I screamed instinctively into the darkness, my voice shrill with panic. But I knew there was no one around to hear. The ground around the hole began to crumble further with my weight. Clawing desperately, I tried to pull myself up, but I couldn't get any leverage. My feet scraped against the shaft wall, searching for a foothold and finding nothing but slick, cold rock. Please, 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 I whimpered through gritted teeth, not even sure who or what I was pleading with. My arms burned, muscles quivering. I was losing my grip. Pebbles and dirt rained down into the abyss below as the edge disintegrated under my fingers. With a final, heart-stopping lurch, the ledge I clung to gave way completely. I fell. The world became a blur of rushing shadows. I barely had time to scream. My shoulder struck something hard, and I ricocheted off the shaft wall. Then, just as suddenly, I landed with a bone-rattling impact on a narrow ledge maybe 20 feet down. Pain exploded through my left shoulder and side. I let out a howl and almost rolled off, but instinctively I flung out my arm and grabbed a spur of rock, pressing my back against the wall to stabilize myself. Everything was darkness. I was panting, my breath loud and echoing. The ledge beneath me was small, maybe the size of a coffee table, and crumbling at the edges. Too terrified to move, I flattened myself against the damp rock wall, legs dangling over the edge into nothingness. I took inventory of my body in panicked breaths. My shoulder throbbed fiercely, I wasn't sure if it was dislocated or just badly bruised. My ankle hurt too, possibly twisted in the fall. But I was alive. Miraculously, I had landed on the only ledge between the top of the shaft and whatever lay at the bottom. Heart pounding, I gingerly felt around the edges of the ledge. It tapered off into a sheer drop after just a few feet in either direction. There was nowhere to go. I couldn't climb up. The shaft walls above were slick, mostly smooth rock. I couldn't go down. One false move and I'd slip off this tiny shelf and continue the plunge. I doubted I'd survive a second time. When the initial adrenaline rush ebbed, the terror of my predicament truly sank in. A strangled sob escaped me. How long would this ledge hold? It felt unstable. Bits of it crumbled off under even slight movement. I screamed again, a raw, primal sound of fear and frustration. Help! Somebody help me! My voice echoed up the shaft, mocking me with its emptiness. No response. Hot tears streaked my face. I shouted until my throat was hoarse, alternating between calling for help and just crying wordlessly into the dark. After what might have been minutes or hours, I had no way to tell. My screams weakened into whimpers. I was so cold. I realized I'd lost my jacket at some point. I vaguely remembered it catching on something as I fell. Now I wore only my thin school shirt, which was torn and filthy. Shivering in the darkness, despair overwhelmed me. This was how people died in scary stories, stupid kids sneaking where they shouldn't, falling into pits. I imagined the headlines, missing boy found dead in abandoned mine. Would my parents even know what happened, or would I just disappear forever, swallowed by the earth? The thought of my family never knowing my fate made my chest ache. I pictured my mother frantically calling my name, and my younger brother and sister wondering why I never came home. I wanted so badly to see Mom again, to tell her I was sorry for running off. Even Dad, at that moment I wouldn't have minded hearing his voice, even if it was one of his angry lectures. Anything was better than this awful silence. My whole body trembled, partly from cold and shock, partly from the sobs I couldn't hold back. I was so scared. More scared than I'd ever been of any bully or any fight at home. This was mortal terror, the real possibility I wouldn't live to see morning. When you're utterly helpless, hanging between life and death, pride and pretense fall away. In that cold loneliness, I did something I hadn't done sincerely in years. I prayed. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking out, and in a broken whisper I begged, "Please, please, God, anyone, help me. I don't want to die. I'm so sorry for coming here. Just please save me." My words tumbled out, half-formed. I bargained desperately. I promised that if I did get out of this, I would do something meaningful with my life, something good. I would make something of myself. Just please, please don't let me die here alone in the dark. When my voice gave out from pleading, I just thought the words, over and over, "Help me. I'm alone. I'm afraid." I cried again, softer this time, the tears of someone who has nothing left. Eventually, utterly exhausted in body and spirit, I think I drifted into a kind of daze. Not quite sleep, there was no way I could truly sleep on that precarious perch, but a half-conscious haze, where time blurred and my mind mercifully dulled the edges of fear and pain. That's when it happened. A light. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Or maybe I'd already died and this was the afterlife. Because something changed in that shaft, something impossible. It began as a soft glow around me. My eyes were closed, but I sensed a warm illumination that had no business being there in the pit of darkness. I blinked in disbelief. I could see my own hands now, lit by a gentle golden radiance. The walls of the shaft, moments ago pitch black, were bathed in that diffuse glow. It wasn't coming from above or below, it was all around, as if the very air itself had begun to shine. My breath caught. For a wild moment I thought maybe a rescuer had found me, shining a light down. But no, this light wasn't from a torch or lamp. It was everywhere, and it was growing brighter. My mind struggled to make sense of it. Maybe I was hallucinating, or maybe I was actually dying and this was a final near-death vision. My heart was pounding again, but not with fear this time. Along with the light, I felt a presence. I wasn't alone anymore. Where moments before I had never felt more abandoned, I now felt someone, with me. It was as if an invisible blanket of calm had settled over my shoulders. The air itself felt warmer, my trembling eased. Out of that glow, just to my left on the same tiny ledge, a figure appeared. I gasped, almost losing my balance. A man was standing right there beside me, where there should have been no room for another person. Before panic could overtake me, I heard a voice, not with my ears exactly, but inside me, gentle and steadying. "Peace. Be still," the voice said. In the soft light, the figure became clear. He was a man, perhaps in his 30s, with short dark hair and a neat beard. He wore a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and tan trousers. Nothing about him screamed angel or ghost. He looked utterly ordinary. And yet, as my eyes met his, I knew in my soul that nothing about this was ordinary. He looked at me with the kindest expression I've ever seen. There was concern in his eyes. He seemed to care about the terrified kid clinging to that ledge, but also reassurance. It's hard to describe, but his gaze made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that things were going to be okay. I couldn't speak. I just stared at him. My mind was racing with questions. Who are you? How are you here? But I couldn't get any words out. He extended his hand to me, palm open. I let out a shaky sob of relief and grabbed it like the lifeline it was. His hand was warm and solid. The moment our skin touched, a wave of strength coursed into my body. I felt my lungs fill deeply with air, as if I'd been suffocating and only now could breathe. Gently, he helped me to my feet. My legs were stiff and my injured ankle screamed in protest, but he kept a steady hand on my shoulder, and somehow I could stand without falling. With him beside me, the fear of plummeting off that narrow ledge vanished. I felt safe. He pointed toward the rock wall behind us. There was an old metal ladder bolted into the rock. Many rungs were missing or rusted through, but a section near us looked intact enough to climb. "Climb," the man said softly. His voice carried quiet authority and endless kindness. My voice came out in a whimper. I'm scared." "I know," he replied, nodding gently. "But you're not alone. I'm right here with you." And I believed him completely. I nodded back. With one hand still feeling the reassurance of his touch, I reached out and grabbed the lowest rung. It held firm. Slowly, I began to climb. One rung after another, I made my way upward. My ankle was throbbing, and I mostly had to rely on one foot. At times the ladder creaked or my grip faltered, but each time, the man's hand was there, supporting me. "Keep going," he encouraged, always just a step behind me. We climbed side by side on that ladder that should scarcely have fit one person, let alone two. But I didn't question it. Every time a rung wobbled or I started to feel unsteady, he steadied me. As we ascended, he spoke in a calm, clear voice, and each word sank deep into my heart. "You are not ending here, Elon. Your life isn't meant to end in this place," he said as I climbed. "You have work to do in the world." I glanced back at him, eyes wide. How did he know my name? But more than that, what work? I was just a kid who felt broken and lost. His words were both comforting and strangely stirring. A part of me dared to feel hope, dared to imagine a future beyond this night. "You'll make it out of here," he continued, "and when you do, remember this, your life has a purpose." Purpose. The word hit me almost as hard as the ground did when I fell. I'd felt so useless and beaten down by life. Purpose? Me? We kept climbing, the circle of night sky above growing larger with each rung. Stars peeked through that opening, guiding us up. He spoke again, each sentence like a soothing balm and a bold challenge all at once. "Use the gifts you've been given, Elon. Use them to help others, to shape the future. You were born with that mind and that heart for a reason." I couldn't stop the tears from flowing down my face. No one had ever talked to me like this. At school my quirks made me a target, at home they were merely tolerated. Yet here I was being told those very things were gifts, that I mattered. I am just a kid, I stammered out as we neared the top, my voice echoing up the shaft. I think I needed to say it, to remind both of us, or maybe just myself, that I wasn't anything special. The man actually gave a gentle smile at that. All great journeys begin with a single step, or climb, he said with a soft chuckle that made me laugh a little through my tears. Before I knew it, I had one hand on the ground above. I hauled myself up over the lip of the shaft, the man never letting go of me until I was fully on solid earth. He climbed out right beside me with impossible ease, never once releasing his supportive grip. I collapsed onto my back on the concrete floor, gasping. The cold night air on my face never felt so wonderful. I was out. I was alive. I turned to look at the man, illuminated by the last golden glow that still hung in the air. My voice came in a fractured, breathless gasp. Thank you. It felt so inadequate, but it was all I had. He reached down and very gently brushed some dirt off my forehead, like a parent might. You don't need to thank me, he said quietly. Just remember what you've promised, and remember what I've told you. I realized then that in my desperate prayers I had made promises, vows that if I survived, I'd do something meaningful with my life. I squeezed his hand, which I still held firmly. I will, I vowed. I promise. I won't forget. The light around us began to dim, blending back into ordinary silver moonlight. Panic flared in me. I didn't even know this man's name, or why, or how any of this was happening. I didn't want him to leave, not yet. Who are you? I whispered. His eyes held mine with a serene certainty. You know who I am, he answered. And in that instant, I did know. Not through logic or deduction, but in the way one knows a sunrise is coming even before the first light breaks. It was as if a veil was pulled from my heart. I thought of the stories I'd heard in church, the images of saints and saviors. He wasn't distant or ethereal like those depictions, but I knew, deeply, unmistakably, I knew. My lips trembled. Jesus? He simply nodded. A flood of emotion overwhelmed me, shock, joy, love, all at once. I'd never been particularly religious, but here he was, not as some untouchable figure in a book, but as someone who cared enough to meet me in a pit in the ground, at my most desperate. Fresh tears blurred my vision. I think I said thank you a dozen more times, I'm not sure. My heart felt like it might burst. He knelt and put his hands on my shoulders, looking into my eyes. I have always been with you, and I always will be, he said softly. You're going to do great things, but never forget, the greatness doesn't come from you alone. Remember this moment when you feel lost or afraid. I nodded, my throat tight. Deep inside, something blossomed, a seed of purpose and faith planted right into my 12-year-old soul. He placed one hand over mine and then glanced upward to the sky. What you build on earth, he said, should inspire people to look toward the heavens. His voice was gentle, but it rang with truth. Don't just give them new technology, give them hope, something greater to aspire to. I knew I'd never forget those words. I wanted to engrave them on my heart. Finally, he pulled me into an embrace. I clung to him, wishing I could stay in that moment forever. But eventually, he stepped back and I had to let go, even though I no longer felt alone. The last of the golden glow was fading. The man, Jesus, took a few steps back. The light clung to him for a heartbeat, outlining his form against the night. I suddenly feared that once he vanished I'd convince myself this hadn't been real. Desperation crept into my voice. Will I see you again? I asked. He gave me that reassuring smile one more time. I'm always here, even when you don't see me. But yes, we will meet again. And then, with that, the light was gone. He was gone. One blink, and I found myself standing alone under the cold stars beside the gaping hole that nearly became my grave. Silence. No glowing figure, no warm light. Just the wind rustling through the construction site. But I was not the same boy I'd been a short time ago. I felt his presence still, lingering like a hand on my shoulder. I felt strength in my legs that hadn't been there before. And inside, I felt an ember of hope glowing, small but steady, and impossible to extinguish. I don't know how long I stood there under the night sky, awestruck and shaking from the enormity of what had just happened. Eventually, my mind started to clear. I needed to go home. I carefully skirted that deadly pit, giving it a very wide berth this time, and found my way back through the fence. On the sidewalk outside, under the pale streetlights, reality set in fully. I fell to my knees, sobbing hard, but these were not tears of fear or pain. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. I had been saved in every sense of the word. I tilted my face up to the stars, tears streaming down, and whispered a thank you into the night, again and again. After a while, I pulled myself together. My parents might have started to worry by now, though, part of me noted, they hadn't noticed earlier. Either way, I needed to return to the world. Every part of my body ached as I stood, but I managed. I spotted my torn jacket near the fence where I dropped it and shrugged it back on for warmth. Limping down the road, I soon reached a main street. As luck, or grace, would have it, a taxi came down the road. I waved it over. The driver looked startled to see a bruised kid out alone at that hour. "You all right?" he asked, concerned. "I got lost," I mumbled, the simplest explanation I could think of. "Can you take me home, please?" I gave him my address. He must have seen the state I was in, but he didn't pry. "Sure thing," he said gently, and I climbed into the back seat. As the taxi pulled away, I slumped against the window. The city lights of Pretoria blurred past, but I barely saw them. I was overwhelmed in the best possible way. I felt like I was overflowing with purpose. There was that word again. Purpose. I was alive for a reason. I had work to do in this world. Staring up at the faint glow of the moon, I quietly made a vow to myself, and to the presence I still felt with me. I promised I would never waste this life. I would use every ounce of whatever gifts I had to do something good, to fulfill the purpose I'd been spared for. I went home that night forever changed. I crept into my house just before dawn, slipping into my bed without waking anyone. In fact, my parents never even realized I had been gone. We never talked about that night. They were so consumed in their own troubles, and I was a quiet kid who suddenly seemed to improve. They didn't question it. And improve I did. By the next morning, the world felt different. The problems that had weighed on me, the bullies at school, the chaos at home, they still existed, but they no longer defeated me. I had something inside me that they couldn't touch, purpose and hope. The bullying gradually lost its power over me. I focused intensely on my studies and my projects. I devoured books on science and engineering, taught myself programming, and poured my energy into creative ideas, little inventions, and coding projects. I didn't tell anyone about what happened in the mine that night. How could I? Who would believe me? I attempted once to tell my mom, saying I'd seen something like an angel, but she just gave me a gentle smile, thinking I was speaking metaphorically. I let it drop and decided to keep my miracle private. Still, it guided everything I did. I knew I was spared for a reason, and I didn't intend to waste that second chance. Over the years, that sense of mission only grew stronger. I finished high school and left South Africa to seek wider horizons. In my 20s, I co-founded an internet startup that gave me the resources to tackle bigger projects. Making money was never the goal, it was a means to an end. By my early 30s, I had started an electric car company, Tesla, aimed at reducing humanity's dependence on fossil fuels and healing our relationship with our planet. I also founded a rocket company, SpaceX, to expand humanity's reach beyond Earth, partly to preserve our species, and partly to inspire people to look up at the stars again. People often ask what possessed me to take on such wild endeavors. They usually assume I'm just a bold dreamer or that I crave innovation for its own sake. They had no idea that behind it all was a quiet promise made by a 12-year-old boy to something divine on a cold night. To the outside world, I became a successful entrepreneur and inventor, maybe even a visionary, as some like to say. But privately, I always remembered that night and the vow I made. Every time I pushed through a setback, whether it was a car battery that kept catching fire or a rocket that exploded on the launch pad, I would think back to that golden light in the darkness and the words that were spoken to me. Your life has a purpose. Use your gifts to help others. What you build should point people to the heavens. Those memories kept me going through the hardest challenges. I stumbled many times and made mistakes. Being shown a miracle didn't make me a saint. But whenever I failed, I felt that promise tug at me, and I kept striving to live up to it. Through all those years, I told no one the full truth. Not my closest friends, not my business partners, not even my family. I came close a couple of times, late at night, staring up at the stars with someone I trusted. I almost said, "Let me tell you why I really do this." But I always held back. I was afraid of what people would think, or that they'd dismiss it as a childish fantasy. Mostly, I worried that if I opened that part of myself to the world, it might somehow cheapen the sacredness of it. And so I carried it alone, quietly letting it drive me, quietly saying a thank you in my heart whenever one of our rockets reached space or one of our cars rolled off the assembly line making zero emissions. In my mind, those weren't just achievements of business or technology, they were fulfillments of a promise. For a long time, I assumed I would keep that secret forever. It would just be something between me and God, between me and Jesus, the one who saved me. I didn't think the world needed to know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to deal with their reactions if they did. I had no idea that events in my life were about to unfold that would challenge that decision. After decades of silence, the moment was approaching when I would have to face the question, should I finally share this story with the world? It was decades later, on a quiet night at SpaceX's headquarters, that I finally understood I couldn't keep my secret forever. I was in my office, long after midnight. Blueprints and financial reports were strewn across my desk. The glow of monitors cast harsh shadows. By then, I was leading thousands of employees across multiple companies. The pressure on my shoulders was immense. Just a week earlier, one of our prototype rockets had exploded during a test, a devastating setback. Tesla was facing production delays on a new car model that investors were furious about. There were regulatory hurdles, technical glitches, disgruntled shareholders, all the storms that come with pushing the boundaries. I was exhausted, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. I had been sleeping on a couch at the factory more nights than I went home. That night, the weight of it all felt crushing. I remember standing by the window, looking out at the dark outline of a Falcon rocket in the hangar across the lot. My chest was tight, my breath shallow and rapid. It hit me that I was having a panic attack, something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The room seemed to spin. I grasped the windowsill to steady myself, feeling utterly overwhelmed and, for the first time in a very long time, alone. In that dizzying moment, my mind flashed back to that 12-year-old boy in the mine. I had the startling realization that despite all my success and all the people around me, I had somehow let myself become that scared, isolated kid again, at least in my own head. I closed my eyes, fighting to breathe. Why am I doing all this? I thought in despair. Is it even worth it? And then I felt it. I opened my eyes and caught a reflection in the window glass behind my own haggard face. Just for an instant, I saw him. I saw the same kind, gentle figure who had stood on that ledge with me all those years ago. Jesus. He was there, only a faint reflection, not a full apparition like before, but unmistakably present. He stood just behind my shoulder in the dim office, meeting my gaze in the window. There were no words this time. He simply gave me a look of deep peace and understanding, the ghost of a reassuring smile. It lasted only a second or two. I whipped around, half expecting to find him standing in my office. But of course, the room was empty. The only light came from the computer screens and the faint glow of the night sky outside. Yet I was not shaken or confused. Instead, I found myself sinking into my chair, releasing a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. A profound calm washed over me, the panic ebbing away as quickly as it had come. I sat there in the silence, a few tears escaping down my cheeks. In that brief reflection, that brief presence, something in me broke open, some burden I'd been carrying alone for too long. All those years, I had kept my experience a secret, believing it was a personal miracle meant only for me. I'd used it as my compass, my private source of strength, and I thought that was enough. But sitting there that night, I realized that perhaps I'd misunderstood part of my mission. Maybe staying silent about it was no longer the right path. I thought about the world, so many people struggling with fear, uncertainty, and loneliness. I realized technology alone can't fill that void of meaning. How many young people had told me our rockets or cars inspired them, yet admitted they still felt lost? How many friends had quietly confessed that they felt their lives lacked purpose? I'd usually respond with practical advice, work hard, dream big, while holding back the deeper comfort I carried in my heart. I never shared the story that had given me hope and purpose. In that moment of clarity, I knew what I needed to do. I could practically hear that gentle voice from my childhood saying, perhaps it wasn't given to you just for yourself. I wiped my face, steadied my breathing, and made a decision. It was time to share my story, openly, honestly, no matter what it cost me. A sense of resolve filled me. I wasn't afraid anymore. For years I'd worried what people might think, that they'd call me crazy, or that it would hurt my companies. Those fears suddenly seemed trivial compared to the importance of the truth. If my story could give even one person hope, if it could help someone not feel so alone in their darkness, then any ridicule or misunderstanding I might face would be worth it. That night, I phoned a trusted colleague and asked him to set up a televised interview for the following week, something I'd usually avoid, given how often the media twisted my words. But this wouldn't be a typical interview about rockets or cars. I had something far more personal in mind. I also reached out to Jessica, a well-respected journalist who had interviewed me a couple of times in the past. I knew she was fair and compassionate. I told her I wanted to discuss a topic I'd never spoken about publicly before, and that it was very important to me. I think she heard the tremor of emotion in my voice, because she agreed without pressing for details. In the days leading up to the interview, I felt oddly at peace. Normally I'd be anxious about how the stock market might react or what my board of directors might say if I suddenly went off script in public. But after my experience that night, those concerns felt secondary. I was about to do something I'd been internally preparing for since I was 12, even if I hadn't realized it. I spent those days quietly gathering my thoughts, even visiting a small chapel near our SpaceX factory during lunch breaks to sit in the silence and make sure I was ready to say what I needed to say. The night of the interview arrived faster than I expected. It was scheduled as a 1-hour primetime conversation. Ostensibly, I was there to discuss our latest technological developments, but Jessica and I had an understanding that at some point, I would steer it to this other subject. Backstage, moments before we went on air, I felt a flutter of nerves. This was, in some ways, going to be a bigger moment than any rocket launch or product reveal I'd ever done. I closed my eyes amidst the bustle of stagehands and producers and whispered a simple prayer, "Give me the right words." A familiar warmth spread in my chest, and I knew I wasn't alone. The bright studio lights snapped on. I walked out to the set to the sound of polite applause from the small studio audience. I shook Jessica's hand and sat down across from her, my heart steady, my purpose clear. Jessica smiled and began with a cordial greeting and her first question, something about our latest rocket. I barely registered it. My heart was thudding with a very different intention. I took a breath, feeling an uncanny calm settle over me, and gently interrupted, "Jessica, before we talk about that, there's something I need to share, something I've never shared publicly before." My voice echoed in the studio. The polite smile on Jessica's face softened into an expression of surprise and curiosity. The audience fell utterly silent. The floor manager's eyes went wide. And with that, I began to finally tell my story. I spoke quietly at first, describing the childhood pain I'd never before discussed in public. I told them about being bullied so badly that I ended up in the hospital. I admitted how isolated I felt at age 12, how my parents were caught up in their own battles and I felt invisible. As I talked, my voice began to tremble despite my resolve. This wasn't a polished executive speaking, it was the wounded kid I'd once been, finally given voice. Jessica's eyes widened with genuine concern as I recounted one especially brutal day of bullying that left me bloodied and desperate. The studio audience had gone utterly still. Camera glimpses of the control booth revealed even the crew leaning in to listen, caught off guard by this turn in the conversation. I described wandering off that day, running away from home in a haze of despair. Jessica gently prompted me with a question or two when I faltered, and I could see empathy on her face. I told them how I ended up at an abandoned construction site, how I climbed some unstable structure without caring whether I fell. My hands shook as I relived that moment, and I didn't try to hide it. The world could see tears shining in my eyes, and I no longer cared about maintaining any stoic facade. I explained how I did fall, how I found myself trapped in a deep, dark pit, injured and completely alone, certain I was going to die there. At that, Jessica whispered, "How long were you down there?" Her voice was gentle, almost motherly. "Hours," I answered, voice trembling. "Hours in pitch blackness." A couple of people in the audience gasped softly as they imagined it. I recalled how hopeless and terrified I was in that darkness. I confessed that in that desperate moment, I prayed, not the formal prayers I'd been taught, but raw, pleading words from a boy who had never truly prayed before. By now, I could see some audience members had tears in their eyes as well. I heard one of the camera operators sniffle. The entire studio was hanging on my every word, barely daring to breathe. Finally, I reached the part of my story that I had kept secret for so long, the part that, even as I spoke, felt almost surreal to reveal on live television. My throat tightened, but I pushed through, remembering the warmth I'd felt in my office that night and drawing strength from it. And then, I said, looking right into the camera, something happened. Something I can only describe as a miracle. My voice was trembling openly now. Jessica's eyebrows lifted in soft surprise, but she didn't interrupt. I took another shaky breath. What happened next, I continued, my voice barely above a whisper yet echoing in the silent studio, changed my life forever. The audience remained completely silent as I told them about the impossible rescue that night in the mine. I described the warm golden light that enveloped me in the darkness, how an inexplicable calm came over me. I confessed, my voice shaking yet steady in conviction, that I saw a figure standing there with me on that crumbling ledge. And then I said the words that caused a collective intake of breath across the studio and, I'm sure, in living rooms around the world, I knew it was Jesus. He saved my life that night. I heard a few muffled gasps. One woman in the audience actually covered her mouth with her hand. Jessica's eyes were wide, glistening with emotion. To her credit, she didn't interrupt or try to rush me. Tears were flowing freely down my face now, but I didn't bother to wipe them away. The cameras zoomed in, I'm sure the image of me, a man known for logic and innovation, crying openly on national TV was shocking to many. But I felt no shame. Only relief. I recounted how he guided me out of that pit, and I even repeated the words I'd heard that night, how I was told my life had a purpose and how what I build on earth should help point people toward the heavens. I described the promise I made in return, to use my life for good, to help humanity, and as those words filled the studio, I saw understanding dawn on so many faces. When I finished sharing the core of my experience, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It felt like I had lifted the heaviest weight off my soul. I glanced at Jessica. She blinked back tears and found her voice. "Thank you for sharing that," she said softly. There was a visible tremble in her hand as she glanced at her notes, which clearly were of no use anymore. She abandoned them and instead asked gently, "How did that encounter shape what you've done through Tesla and SpaceX?" I think everyone here can sense this is the why behind so much for you. I nodded gratefully. This was my chance to connect the dots for people. It's absolutely the why, I replied. I've always said my goal with Tesla was to accelerate sustainable energy, and with SpaceX to make humanity multiplanetary. Those are the surface reasons. But underneath, it was because I believe we have a duty, a purpose, to use our gifts to protect and inspire humanity. I paused, wiping my face with the cuff of my sleeve. After that night, I felt I was living on borrowed time given for a reason. So I pursued projects that I hoped would benefit everyone. Tesla isn't just a car company to me, it's a way to break our dependence on polluting fuels and care for the world we've been given. SpaceX isn't just about rockets, it's about expanding our understanding of creation and inspiring hope beyond our day-to-day troubles. Jessica interjected quietly, "It sounds like, to you, science and faith aren't at odds." I managed a small smile. "Not at all," I said. "For me, science is just the tool and language we use to appreciate the complexity of what I believe is a divinely ordered universe. The more I learned about physics, about the fine-tuned constants that allow life to exist, the more I saw it as compatible with the idea of design. For a long time I kept those thoughts to myself. But yes, exploring space or inventing technology has always been something of a spiritual endeavor for me. It's my way of following the guidance I received, to point people toward the heavens, literally and figuratively." The studio was absolutely still, except for an occasional muffled sob. I suspected even the skeptics in the room were too moved by the sincerity of the moment to object. As the interview went on, Jessica gave me space to elaborate on how I'd struggled privately with whether or not to reveal this story. I admitted my fears, that people would think I'd lost my mind or that investors would panic or that I'd be mocked relentlessly. "I'm sure some people will react like that," I said. But I realize now that staying silent, hiding this part of me, might have been a disservice to others who might find comfort or meaning in it. At one point, the producers signaled that social media was exploding with reactions. On a screen off to the side, I could see a live feed of comments streaming in from around the world. Jessica read a few aloud with my permission. One was from a self-described atheist who wrote, "I never thought I'd say this, but Elon Musk's story has me in tears and rethinking some things." A mother wrote, "Watching this with my teenage son, we're both crying. Never expected such heart and faith from a tech icon." A young man posted, "I feel hope for the first time in ages. Thank you, Elon." And another viewer commented, "As a scientist and a person of faith, thank you for bridging that false divide. This means more than you know." Hearing those reactions in real time nearly broke me down again. My whole goal in coming forward was being validated right in front of my eyes. People were feeling exactly what I prayed they would feel, that spark of hope, that sense of connection beyond the material. Nearing the end of the hour, Jessica, who had long abandoned any pretense of detachment, asked one final question softly, almost reverently, "Elon, for anyone out there who is in that dark place you described, feeling alone on their own crumbling ledge, what would you want to say to them?" I turned to the camera, imagining I was speaking directly to that scared boy or girl out there, or that despairing man or woman who had given up on miracles. My eyes were wet again, but my voice was clear. "First," I said earnestly, "you are not alone, even when you think you are. I truly believe there is a presence in this universe that loves you and watches over you. I certainly felt it watching over me. Second, your life has purpose. The pain, the struggles, they can shape you for something meaningful. I thought I was worthless at 12, and it turned out I had a life of meaning ahead of me that I couldn't see. You have one too. And third, I managed a little smile through my tears. Help can come from unexpected places. It did for me. I think this universe, or God, or however you name it, has a way of reaching us when we truly need it. Sometimes in very miraculous ways." By the time I finished, I noticed Jessica dabbing at her eyes. Many in the audience were openly crying and nodding. The feeling in the air was something I can only describe as sacred, as if we had all shared a transcendent experience together. The interview wrapped up with Jessica thanking me for my honesty and courage. Instead of our usual handshake, she reached across and squeezed my hand in a gesture of solidarity. "Thank you, Elon," she said, voice thick with emotion, "for trusting us with this." I gave her a grateful, slightly tremulous smile. "Thank you for listening," I replied softly. As the studio lights dimmed to close the broadcast, the audience suddenly erupted into applause, not the polite clapping from earlier, but a standing ovation that echoed in the studio. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling utterly drained yet profoundly peaceful. I sat back in my chair as the cameras cut away, utterly spent but lighter than I'd ever been. I felt, for the first time in my adult life, completely aligned, free to integrate every part of who I am, free of the fear of what others might think. In the hours and days that followed, the world reacted in ways I never imagined. Yes, there were a few jokes and skeptics, some pundits questioned my sanity, and a couple of investors nervously fretted, but I had expected that. None of it bothered me now. Far more significant was the overwhelming outpouring of support, wonder, and gratitude that flooded in. Millions of people who had never heard me speak about anything beyond technology were now sending messages about how my vulnerability had touched their lives. Colleagues and strangers alike shared their own stories of light in the darkness, some spiritual, some deeply personal. Turning points, saying they felt inspired by what I had revealed. Even a few well-known fellow innovators and public figures stepped forward on social media to share their reflections on faith and purpose, encouraged by the conversation that interview sparked. I heard that in homes across the country, families talked late into the night after watching the interview, discussing topics of faith and purpose they might never have broached otherwise. Even some of my fellow scientists and engineers quietly approached me in private to say, "I've always sensed something beyond just equations too." For me, the greatest reward was knowing that the hope I received that night long ago might spread to others now. In sharing my deepest truth, I had pointed, as I was instructed, to something greater than ourselves. And that, more than any rocket launch or electric car, felt like the most important thing I could ever contribute.